This year, we saw a U.S. election that the candidates seem to agree is the most significant of our lifetime. We saw shifting last-minute candidates, assassination attempts, trials, and all on the backdrop of dynamic and volatile international events, conflicts, and natural disasters here at home. We take a look at the year that was. Joining us now to discuss is Mike Leon, NTD News contributor and host of the Can We Please Talk podcast. Good to have you with us, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
Now, there are so many defining moments in U.S. politics this year. How would you describe the year that was?
Whoa, how would I describe the year that was? I think chaotic is an understatement, right? I mean, we just crammed so many different things. You just mentioned it right there, just the highlights of a presidential election, but you didn't even go into detail of the incumbent president getting kicked out from his own party and then being replaced with the vice presidential nominee, and we didn't even have a contested convention. That's just on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, obviously, we had the assassination attempt. We had another one that was foiled down here in my neck of the woods in Florida. You've mentioned so many things that have happened on the global stage as well. And there's just been so much chaos since October 7th, specifically in the Middle East with what's happened in Gaza, what happened on the attacks on October 7th, what's happened now in Lebanon, what's happened in Syria as well with the fall of Assad's regime. So there's just been so much crammed into the global calendar in 2024, not only here in the U.S., but beyond. But I think chaotic tends to encapsulate all of that, Steph.
Yeah, so with that in mind, I mean, where is it taking us in terms of what do you see carrying over? What are some of the lessons that you think may have been collectively learned in this past year?
Well, I'm glad you said the lessons part, right? Because I think the biggest lessons part, and you and I talked about this, and Don as well, has been the Democratic side, right? In terms of how they message and how they run candidates and how some of the things that they tried to do against the Republican president-elect and Donald Trump just didn't work, and it fell on deaf ears. I look at my medium as well in podcasting. I think podcast played a huge role in presidential campaigns, in the way people get their message out, in interviews that are now conducted by people that maybe don't have, I have a journalism background, but maybe folks that don't have a journalistic background that will provide at least, a home and a space for conversation for folks. And I'm not only talking about the Joe Rogans, but just the Theo Vons and Aiden Rosses. I think podcasting has really kind of changed the way we look at interviews and the way candidates and the way they're humanized and the way content is created around them. So I think the lessons learned will definitely be applied into 2026 and beyond when we get into the midterms and when we get into the presidential elections. But I think there's going to be some things, some pre-court decisions I know we'll get into that have really impacted the way policy will be shifted or created in this country going forward and the way presidents will act. And we'll see all of that take place once President-elect Trump comes into power on January 21st.
For sure, closely watching. As you mentioned, there were many consequential decisions by the Supreme Court this year, decisions on presidential power, administrative law, the Second Amendment, various others. What are you looking at specifically in terms of what's going to carry on into next year and how it could impact the dynamics at play?
Yeah, so let's do the first one, because obviously Melina just mentioned about the presidential immunity. I mean, that is obviously huge, because now there are unofficial acts committed by a president and then there are official acts. And I think that is incredibly subjective, just speaking to legal scholars. And it's going to be very difficult to prove if a president, and it doesn't have to be President Trump, it could be anybody after, commits something that could be considered a crime. Was it under the guise of the official act as president, or was it unofficial act, right? So that's going to be something that's going to be up to the legal beagles out there to interpret going forward. I think one big thing that happened this year with the Supreme Court ruling was really around a few social media cases that involved the state I live in here in Florida and obviously in Texas as well, and the interpretation of whether or not an administration can actually use social media to kind of dispel some of the things that are going around rhetoric-wise on social media. And we're seeing it play out over the last couple of days. Elon Musk has been getting into some conflicts with Laura Loomer and some other conservatives that are very upset and think that there is some free speech being violated. And I'm here to explain to people, as somebody who's worked in product and technology for 20 years, just listen to me, folks. When you hit the I agree button, that means you have opted into terms of use and terms of service on a platform. So your speech is subject to modification and content modification. So that means if you say something that is not in line with the policy, you can be stripped from that platform. So hear me when I say this. There is no such thing as free speech when you hit opt in or I agree onto a platform. And I think that's one of the things that the Supreme Court ruled on. And that's going to be something that in 2025 going forward, Steph, we're going to see a lot of people aiming their ire at some of these social media platforms.
Social media is still so much on the agenda and shifting dynamics there. We've seen with big tech companies, getting on this good side of Trump or trying to. We have TikTok also still in the works, that the potential ban there, or the ban that looks like it's going ahead. We'll see. But based on what we've seen this year in U.S. and politics as well, what's in your sights particularly for 2025?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, it starts in January, right? It starts with President-elect Trump. And then obviously over the first 100 days, as everyone's going to be looking at the administration, it's really about these confirmation hearings that are coming up, right? Because we don't know the status of if people will vote for Pete Hegseth to run the largest military in the world when he doesn't have a background running anybody over 50 employees at a nonprofit. We're going to see if Tulsi Gabbard will head DNI, which is really responsible for our gathering of national intelligence and the coordination of our agencies. We're going to see about if Kash Patel is confirmed as FBI director, right? Somebody who has been, very outspoken about the deep state and what does happen and the bureaucracy that happens, which does happen. Bureaucracy happens as part of the government, but does it rise to the level that he's saying? We're going to find out if he's confirmed. So there's a lot of things that I'm going to be watching for in the first 100 days under the Trump administration. But then there's also, these campaign promises that Donald Trump made about these wars, Steph. The American taxpayers are paying for a lot of the funding that goes into the weaponry for Ukraine. Does that war start to settle down, and does something happen from a negotiation standpoint? There's still outstanding hostages that Hamas took from October 7th. What happens there in the hostage negotiations? And then what's playing out, obviously, with Israel and Gaza? Obviously, we saw a little bit of a ceasefire with Lebanon. What's happening in Syria? Does the U.S. get involved? There's a civil war happening in Sudan. We didn't even mention that. So there's a lot of things that I'm going to be watching for over the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And some of these things are going to come home to roost, and we're going to all find it out because it's going to be playing out in front of all of us to watch.
Lots to watch there. Thank you so much, Mike Leon. That's all we have time for right at the moment, but I am sure we'll be speaking again soon. Thank you again.
Thanks, Steph. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.